Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now today we're going to be talking about appropriate measures, thinking about scales and variables and other elements necessary when we're trying to measure something. And so we kind of go day to day thinking about things that we have to measure. After all, some of you, after this lecture, may go to a shoe store and say, well, I'd like a shoe in this size. Do you say inches? Do you say centimeters? Do you say meters? Hopefully not. And so we're always trying to measure things in life, but we do this kind of on a subconscious plane. We're not really actively thinking about different kinds of measurements. But because this is a media analytics course, a research course, it's important that when we start thinking about what to measure and how to measure something, we start thinking about scales. But before we do that, the first portion of this lecture is going to be an overview of hypotheses, facts, and laws, and understanding relationships between variables. Variables is probably the best place to start here. We're going to be talking about variables during lecture as well. So one variable might be a concept regarding brand loyalty. So brand loyalty could be a variable, right? A variable is a measured concept, a measured construct. You might read either in a textbook or in a research article. And so you might say, okay, we have brand loyalty as something we want to measure among our customers. Great. What does that mean? What does brand loyalty mean when we start thinking about it, though? Everybody seems to think, oh yeah, loyalty to a brand, but am I loyal, for instance, to the New York Yankees because I constantly purchase tickets? Is that a measurement of loyalty? Or is a measurement of loyalty the amount of games viewed? Or is it something else that I'm doing? When we think about how to operationalize brand loyalty, now we're defining the variable. That's the second key distinction to make here, is the operationalization of a variable. In other words, how do we define a variable? What do you mean by brand loyalty? What do you mean by perceived quality? Perceived quality is another variable that a lot of advertising and public relations firms may measure for. Or customer satisfaction. How are you defining customer satisfaction? So when you're starting to define a variable, we get into operationalization. And academics in multitudes of articles regularly debate and expound upon what does each derivation of each variable really mean. Is brand loyalty here really measuring brand loyalty? Or is brand equity really being measured here? Or is time being measured here appropriately? Is gender being measured appropriately? What about age? What about income? And so these debates really rage in academia, but even in industry. In industry, you have to think about different kinds of scales you're going to be using for your client. And so with all of that being stated as a really nice groundwork for moving forward, let's get started. How do we understand and evaluate phenomenon? Now, hopefully some of you noticed that I'm wearing a blue shirt. I hope this is not like the blue gold dress from a few years ago. I think we can all agree I am wearing a blue shirt. I'm wearing a blue shirt. A fact is something that cannot be disputed. It is a statement that is indisputable. It has some sort of indisputable description that we can all agree on. The sun rises every day from our viewpoint on planet Earth. These are facts. A hypothesis, this is regularly misused by a lot of people, but a hypothesis tests the relationship between two variables. It tests the relationship between two variables. So it could very well be that you want to see, for instance, that the earlier I wake up, the longer the sun is out during the day, right? That's kind of testing the relationship between the amount of hours that you're up and the amount of hours that we can see the sun. Kind of testing a positively directed hypothesis there, right? As I increase the amount of hours I am up during the day, I am predicting that the sun will be out longer, for instance. Theories are different from hypotheses. So when we think about a theory, what we're trying to do is explain what's going on, kind of the hidden process that is going on, the underlying process that is going on in our world. So for instance, in the last few years, we've seen an uptick, an increase in the amount of African Americans who go to movie theaters. Fine. How do we explain that? One way that we can explain this is through, perhaps, the social identity theory. Social identity theory states that we see ourselves in groups and in memberships, and we tend to gravitate toward elements in society that house these groups. And so, if we're seeing African Americans on the screen, and lately we've seen Moonlight, we've seen a lot of different movies come out that are African American driven in cast, well, maybe if we test that theory, that can explain the uptick, the increase in African Americans going to the movies. And so theories really do help us understand what's going on in reality. And so theories, though, have to be tested. Could social identity theory also be applied to why so many Hispanic Americans watch soccer? Maybe, I don't know. It would have to be tested, and we'd have to think of a design, and we'd have to think of variables. And so theories are very useful because they also help us organize knowledge. That is the second reason why we love theories. First, to describe underlying phenomenon in reality. Second, to organize information. For academics, for practitioners, for people who want to read up on a theory, a law. Now, I won't do it, but if I dropped my glasses here in the studio, I suspect they would break, or there would be a chip, or something would happen. I also suspect they would fall down every time that I drop them. This is known as the law of gravity. It's a law. It's always going to happen, at least here on planet Earth. A theory can be supported or unsupported, as can a hypothesis, which can also be supported and unsupported. Theories over time may not be applicable to certain phenomenon, but a good theory has been demonstrated time and time again across multiple studies, across multiple angles. Let's keep going. And so sunlight and plants, just to make sure that we're clear on this. Fact, plants grow in sunlight. Okay, so let's say that it's 5,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, we all live in the woods, let's say, and let's agree that we have some sort of village, and we're just trying to figure out how these green things are growing from the ground. And so we may put out a research question: why do plants grow in sunlight? Simply put, why do plants grow in sunlight? We may also put out hypotheses. As sunlight exposure increases, plants will grow. Okay, so we have a positive relationship there. Hypothesis 2, as sunlight exposure increases, plants will become stronger. Hypothesis 3, as sunlight exposure increases, plants will compete more for sunlight in order to survive. Okay, we take these hypotheses, we test it out with carrots, potatoes, corn, trees, fig trees, lemon trees, right? We're testing this across everything. We keep seeing these hypotheses being supported. We might be seeing the same phenomenon over and over again? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we might have a theory. This is how a theory is developed. You see the same thing happening over and over again, the same phenomenon being unearthed in studies. Here's the theory. Sunlight is necessary for plant growth and development because it can help energize internal processes, metabolic processes. And so from there, then we may have a law. Although some plants don't really require too much sunlight, and certain plants have different restrictions, and then obviously with fungi it can grow in the dark. But a law would be, if we got to that point, all plant life requires sunlight to survive. If we got to that point. But a law is absolute, and it will always tell you what will happen. A law will always tell you what will happen. A theory will tell you how something will happen. It's very difficult to make the jump from a theory to a law, though. It is exceptionally difficult. And there are very few laws out there because there are very few absolute truths. Let's keep going. What is a variable? A variable helps measure certain elements within a theory. So it should measure a concept that varies. That's important as well, such as satisfaction with Nintendo, which may vary from person to person. For instance, and I mentioned this earlier, we may use social identity theory to explain why African Americans are attending movie theaters. But how might we measure this? And I said this earlier with brand loyalty. We might think of a bunch of different elements here. For one, we could think about measure for viewing and brand loyalty toward the movie, maybe relationships with actors in film, right? All of this might be related to social identity theory. These are variables that we can rely on as we're looking at these particular phenomenon, this particular phenomenon. As I mentioned earlier, we also have the operationalization of variables. We have to define what brand loyalty is. Is it people's disinclination to switch from brand to brand? I don't really switch from a lot of brands. If I have one, shampoo brand, I use it. One car brand, I use it. One conditioner brand, I use it. Is that how we define a variable, such as brand loyalty? Or are we measuring it just based on the amount of times you purchase the product? How are we measuring for a variable? So that's another conversation to have. Let's keep going. Variables are factors that we can measure to better understand a process. A theory may explain why or how something occurs, as we stated earlier. A variable must always be operationalized. It absolutely must be defined. For instance, brand loyalty is a variable, but it must be operationalized. And here I have two definitions: attitudinal loyalty, attitude toward the brand itself, and behavioral loyalty, the amount of times one purchases a product from a brand. Let's keep going. Designing hypotheses. So if we have our variables, if we think we're going to be measuring the amount of times people view television, or we measure customer satisfaction, or we measure brand loyalty, or we measure brand equity, right? The value perceived behind a brand. Well, in designing a hypothesis, we really want to think about direct and indirect relationships. And we also want to think about independent variables versus dependent variables. Remember, an independent variable impacts a dependent variable. Whether or not you will put on your jacket, a dependent variable, is impacted by the temperature outside, the independent variable. And so being sure of independent and dependent variables is critical here. A hypothesis is first and foremost a statement about a relationship. Your goal should state whether there is a direct or indirect relationship. As consumers study more for their exams, consumers will have higher grades. As consumers watch more television, they have darker perceptions of the world, right? You want to think about first putting the independent variable and then adding the dependent variable in. This is a bolder statement from a research question, as there is usually more literature to support a hypothesis. And so it's up to you whether you want to state a research question or hypothesis in life. A hypothesis is usually reliant on a lot more information. It's kind of a bolder claim. A research question would say, well, this is kind of exploratory. We really don't know the implications of virtual reality headsets and direct advertising to customers, right? That's kind of a new field right now as we have advertisements being designed, especially out in California, for virtual reality-based consumption. Let's keep going. Research questions and hypotheses. So again, very quickly, a research question is meant to be exploratory in nature. What do we not know about? Do we know a little bit about something? Has this really been studied? If it hasn't, then maybe I'll ask a question. Differently, a hypothesis is a deliberate and refined statement about a relationship with substantial previous research to support its testing. So for instance, positive Nintendo video game console-specific brand loyalty, brand personality perceptions will have a positive impact on Nintendo brand loyalty. Pardon me. So this idea that brand personality perceptions, positive ones about Nintendo, can impact brand loyalty is a statement. The way that we perceive brand personality traits can ultimately endear us toward the brand, especially if they're positive, and we might be able to harvest brand loyalty towards said brand. Let's keep going. Mediation. So, sometimes we will have multiple variables. It's not always just two. Sometimes we'll have three. And so I just want to be clear here so that everybody can follow me here. So all of you who are listening, I gather, are students. And so you may say to yourself, well, I have an exam tomorrow. Myself as a professor, I am sorry to beleaguer you with said exam. And so you may say to yourself, okay, study effort will impact the grade earned on a test. I know that there's another variable here, just bear with me. Study effort, which is the independent variable, and grade earned on test, the dependent variable, there's a relationship there. You may introduce a third variable though, a mediator. A mediator offers reason or is the missing link between two variables. Study effort will impact the grade earned on a test, right? If I'm studying and studying and studying, I am likely to get an A, but what's the method? Am I using flashcards? Is that an effective way to study? Or am I studying with a friend? Or am I rewriting my notes? Or am I just kind of chilling and just rereading chapters? I could reread chapters all day. I still may get a C on that exam or a D. It's possible that even though I'm investing so much time and effort, I'm still not getting the result. And that's where mediation comes into play. You're thinking about other variables that may impact this relationship. Let's keep going. Moderation. A moderator influences the relationship between two variables, but it is not necessary. So if we go back to the other slide briefly, you can see here that in the middle of that particular slide, you can see the type of study. You can see the type of study is relevant here. And so you have to pick the type of study. You have to pick the way in which you're going to study for the exam, right? Is sleep necessary between studying and the grade on the exam? It's good to sleep before an exam, but is it necessary? No, not in the chain of events, right? You could study, not sleep at all, and then take the test and get a grade on the exam, right? And so a moderator kind of takes a step back and says, okay, We're not directly implicated in this process, but we still may be moderating the relationship between study effort and grade on the exam. Let's keep going. Measurements. Yay, we're getting there. We're getting there. So, measurements. Now we're going to be thinking about different ways in which we can measure for something. Scales. Now, often when we think of scales, we might be thinking of the beach, we might be thinking of weight loss, we might be thinking of weight gain, we might be thinking about doing one of those things to look good on the beach. But when we talk about scales in academia, what we're talking about are different measures on behalf of a variable. Great. You want to measure for brand loyalty. Fine. What is your scale? And so often we'll use scales in surveys. Those are those questions that you take in a survey, or even indicators in a survey, right? State how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. Those statements aren't always questions, so sometimes we call them indicators. And so even in an experiment, we might have you play a video game and watch television and answer a few questions about your moods and things like that, right? Or answer a few indicators and how well you agree or disagree with the following statements. These are all housed under the umbrella of measurements. And so once we've agreed upon the variables, we've agreed upon the theory that we are examining to help explain this phenomenon, the next step is measurements. The next step is getting a sense of how we think we're going to pursue this road. So let's keep going. Nominal. Basic way to look at something. And so a nominal measurement looks at items as categories. So we can look at biological sex or identify gender if we still stick with male, female. Many people now kind of have more of a scaled approach to measuring gender because a lot of people identify with a lot of different gender-based identities. We do this with ethnicity and we do this with the employer, or an employer, excuse me. Numbers are assigned to demarcate differences, but there is no numerical difference between answers. Okay, so let me back up here. So in a survey, I might ask you your gender, male, female. In a survey, I might ask you your ethnicity, Caucasian, African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, other, Vietnamese American, whatever it may be. I may also ask you what kind of car you drive, Honda, Mercedes-Benz, whatever it may be. If I assign Honda 0, Mercedes-Benz 1, and Chrysler 2, those numbers have no meaning for the answers, correct? Is 0 to 1 a difference between Honda and Mercedes-Benz? No, I'm not measuring for differences in between the brands. Here we have a representation of male, female. If I designate the male answer as 0, or if I give it a 1, and I give the female answer 2, does that mean that females are better than males? No. Does it mean that males are better than females if I give males a 2 and females a 1, just to differentiate the answer responses? No. No, it has no bearing. So a key for nominal is that it doesn't measure for numerical differences. This also goes into political affiliation, right? If you give Republicans a 2 and Democrats a 1, does that mean Republicans are 1 unit better than Democrats? No, you're just simply trying to split out the answers here. That's the goal here. That's really what you're trying to do. Let's keep going. Things get a little bit more complex, though, as we move along. Ordinal. This is a second kind of measurement. Questions with attributes are ranked. This may include frequencies. The difference between rankings are not important. Ranking favored television show or ranking favored politicians. So you may say, oh, I'm going to rank my favorite video games or rank my favorite TV shows. Definitely love Blackish, then I'd probably pick Mix-ish, then I'd probably pick, gosh, I don't know, The Voice. Even though these answers are being ranked, it doesn't mean that, for instance, Blackish is 2 units better than The Voice. I'm simply ranking my preferences, but we're still not measuring for differences between the answers. If I say that I like the Big Bang Theory more than The Office, all I'm doing here is ranking it. I'm still not telling you by how much. When we look at the next measurement, though, this is what most social scientists and absolutely most hard scientists will use. Let's keep going. Interval. This is kind of what we are used to, most familiar to many of us. An interval measurement considers the distance between the answer choices. So now on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about A, B, and C? On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like The Office? On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like Blackish, Mixish, Off the Boat, whatever it may be? On a scale of 1 to 5, how do you like Fortnite, Halo, whatever it may be? Now we're able to see differences between answer choices. This may include something as well like weight and height, right? We're able to see differences here. I can see if you weigh more than me. I can see if you weigh less than me. We're now getting into measuring differences between answers. And as best as we can, we try to measure all kinds of variables by this as best as we can. A scale 1 to 5, a scale 1 to 10, those are always the best ways to measure as much as we can. Again, we can't really measure gender in that fashion. We can't really measure political identification in that matter, although we could measure how well you see yourself aligned with Republican values or Democrat values. That is something in which we now get into the interval level of measurement, which is a little bit more precise than simply saying, well, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, what have you. Let's keep going. Ratio. We usually don't have this in social sciences. We absolutely have this in chemistry, in biology, and in mathematics because you have to have an absolute zero here. This level of measurement is just like the interval measure, but it recognizes that there is an absolute zero. So this includes things like income level, which we could measure to the absolute zero, amount of fluid ounces found in a cup. It is possible to have zero here. Generally speaking, in social sciences, you probably won't see this as much. We generally try to push as far as we can with interval on a scale of 1 to 5, but not really looking at values that may have zero for that matter. As we can see, there are a lot of different measurements that are available to us. If we're doing a market research project or any kind of media research project, we have to think about what we know. Facts are really important, even in industry research, because we don't want to research things that we already know. We don't really want to conduct an experiment or survey about things that we already know. So reading industry reports is important. We come up with hypotheses based on kind of what we've seen done and how we understand a particular phenomenon. We then try to find a theory, one, to help explain the phenomenon, and then two, to really help us organize information. When I'm doing my own studies, I usually look for particular theories to help explain a phenomenon under my investigation. And so if I can look through an academic library for studies related to social identity theory or consumer behavior or consumer brand equity, consumer-based brand equity model, or whatever else I'm looking at, it allows me to see all of the studies that have found this, this, and this about a particular theory. And then I can kind of think about, well, what's my theoretical contribution based on my study? Additionally, we also looked at variables here. We looked at how to operationalize variables and kind of thinking about how do we define customer satisfaction or brand loyalty or the amount of episodes people view. Do they have to view the entire episode? Is it only 20 minutes? Is it only 15 minutes of an episode? How do we define that? And then kind of moving along into variables and really thinking about when we have multiple variables, what kind of relationships can we test for? In the next section, we're going to be getting into statistics and we're going to be getting into p-values. And I promise it's not going to be that scary, but just enough so that we can interpret academic results so that you'll be more empowered in academia as well as in industry. That's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.